RE4's over-the-shoulder camera increases the viscerality while decreasing the player's periphery. Now, a lot of people have opined on RE4's shoulder-mounted perspective, so I'll get it out of the way first. Everyone knows that the camera shift jolted new life into the Undead franchise, but how? What is the new camera doing? RE4 producer Shinji Mikami is the big brain behind the brain-blowing change, and he knew early on that moving the camera to this spot would crank up the experience. I say early on because the change was made during RE4's protracted prototyping phase, as you can see here. From this perspective, the player is immersed in RE4's horror. Even zombie hugs can startle at eye level, and there's plenty to go around. Even when things are going well and you're braining ganados, RE4 looks a whole lot like your favorite schlock horror flick. But because this perspective limits your periphery, things frequently do not go well in Resident Evil 4. The game's tight quarters are made tighter with Leon's tunnel vision, and it's common for enemies to attack from unseen angles. In the early game, the confining perspective isn't overly noticeable, but when the enemies get faster, uglier, and lethaler, oh, it's gonna test ya. Like this courtyard segment. You're running around like a scared little ninny boy while zombie pups are always one flippin' second away from an ambush. Capcom, them smarties, amplified the tension with effective sound design. You often hear the enemies before you see them, again because of the limited perspective, and it leaves you feeling like helpless prey rather than predator. Compare this to the early Resident Evils, where the entire game is played using cameras fixed in the environment. You can do some cool things with environmental cameras, like dramatic framing, but what you can't do is easily surprise the player with them, because they reveal most or all of the playable space as soon as the player walks in. Enemies are usually exposed immediately. In the throwback Resident Evils, if an enemy did get the jump on you, it's because they were concealed by something in the environment, concealed by an awkward camera angle, or because they jump out during a triggered event. What you'll note is that in every instance, the scare only works once, because there's no hiding from the all-seeing environmental cameras. The RE4 camera is the opposite, artificially hemmed in so that you can be freaked out over and over, even with the same enemies in the same area. The horror is emergent. It ebbs and flows depending on where enemies are located, relative to the player's control of the camera. I'd argue this spontaneous horror approach is more satisfying and more sophisticated. It's also a clear design point, as RE's other horrifying tricks also rely on it. Trick number 2 involves that teeny tiny, oh so precious red dot. Every time combat is initiated in Resident Evil 4, it's all about that dang dot. Your success hinges entirely on controlling that adorable little firefly, so you better believe you'll be staring at it a whole lot. And if you're staring at the dot, then the chances that a mook will get the drop on you go up. Combine trick number 1, the already tight camera, with trick number 2, and it's practically guaranteed that you'll get axed, knifed, pitchforked, or chainsawed by someone you never saw coming. Ah, but that's not all. Sure, the bright eye-drawing dot clouds your periphery further, but that's not all that little bugger's for. Because you're dealing death via the dot, you'll spend much of RE4 staring down one aberration after another. That's unnerving enough, having to remain steady while undead man, beast, or otherwise bears down on you. But the tension plays up even more when precision is called for. The only way to reliably down the zombie hordes is to intuit how they move, so you can lead your aim appropriately. Now that's just muscle memory, like any other game, but in RE4, you're building this muscle memory by observing the game's menacing menagerie up close. By the end of Leon's quest, you'll be intimately familiar with how the ganados shamble, how the plagas squirm and twitch, and how the regenerators slide across the floor after being knocked over. You won't earn that knowledge, though, without dealing with a good bit of unsettling ickiness that helps play the horror up. Again, this brand of horror is emergent. If you play RE4 extremely safe, you can learn how the enemies move and behave from a distance. You can always run, gather yourself, and piece together a new game plan, but you know, failure is a possible state for every plan. If the player can't think on the fly and react to how enemies are moving and behaving relative to each other, then that dot's gonna make you a sitting duck. Trick number 3, and what may be the smartest trick in Mikami and Capcom's bag, is how the aiming and shooting controls are gunked up compared to earlier Resident Evils. In Resident Evil 1 through 3, moving Jill, Chris, Leon, or Claire is akin to driving an RC car around. Movement controls are relative to where the player is facing, and it takes some getting used to. The shooting mechanics, though, are dead simple. No precision necessary, just spin your dude around until they're facing the enemy and jam that button till the zombie's head pops. There's not a ton of grace to it, and it leads to a lot of tedious, not-so-horrific kiting. Look, the old Resident Evils were clunky, but the clunkiness helped drive the horror. The movement controls were just finicky enough that during a tense moment, the player was likely to screw up their escape and run straight into danger. It's during these moments, when the player's agency is interfered with, that the horror presents itself. Removing agency is a vital element of effective horror, whether in a game or in a movie. Horror movies, for example, are usually at their most horrifying when some poor on-screen sap is rendered helpless and knows he's done for. To simulate that in an interactive format, robbing some of the player's agency during high-stress sequences works wonders. With their unwieldy movement controls, RE1 through 3 set the player up for self-sabotage when it's most inconvenient, leading to instant terror and an exhilarating adrenaline dump. In Resident Evil 4, though, Mikami did away with the tanky movement controls, perhaps to add a dash of action to the formula. RE4 Leon is much more agile than previous protagonists, so you're less liable to drive the poor boy into some zombies waiting open arms. Here, Capcom and Mikami gave some of the aforementioned player agency back, and that reduces the potential for hilarious horror. Maybe this is why some Resident Evil fans are reluctant to call RE4 a true survival horror game, because Leon can get himself out of danger by sprinting away like a big old fraidy cat. Fair enough, but it's not that simple, because Mikami and Capcom didn't delete the cheeky clunkiness entirely. Instead, they moved it from the movement side of the controls to the aiming and combat. Yep, instead of janky movement and simple shooting mechanics, RE4 gives us smoother movement and rougher aiming and shooting. In early Resident Evils, it's point and press the shoot button. In RE4, you glide to a spot to attack from, plant yourself, and get as many accurate shots in before you're overwhelmed by the undead. Rinse and repeat. Leon's got a pretty steady, though not perfect shooting hand, but what leaves him and you vulnerable is how slow he adjusts his aim. While acquiring a target, the former RPD standout moves his arms around like the air is made of butter. No matter how pristine your aim is, Leon is just too slow a marksman to allow players to stay put and shoot. Now, this is integrated into the combat so well that you never think, man, shouldn't this super duper special forces guy have better reflexes? The aiming and shooting mechanics are so beautifully fine-tuned, the perspective so immersive, and the enemies so threatening that it never sticks out. You're too busy staring down that red dot to notice. And guess what? The sluggish aiming and shooting also lend themselves to emergent horror. Get a little too overconfident and miss a shot, and RE4 goes from action to horror instantly. When this happens depends almost entirely on how well you handle the combat. Players that mastered the finicky movement in early Resident Evils were able to drain much of the horror out of the games, as you can run past most enemies if you know what you're doing. In RE4, however, you're encouraged to master the most fun part of the game, the zombie killing. Now that's just good design, and even if you are an RE4 Terminator, Leon is always just one whiffed attack away from being lunch. The horror is always under the surface, ready to surface depending on what the player does. And even though it may not feel as survival horror-y as the first few REs, I'd argue that RE4 was always the way Resident Evil was meant to be played. Because really, when you think horror, do you imagine something like this? Or something like this? So those are the tricks that RE4 uses to sell the horror, but RE4 of course does so many things well. The strong vocal performances, the fantastic visual direction, the resource management sub-game baked into the improved inventory system, the great set pieces, a tastefully added progression system, more inspired enemies, even the franchise's obligatory escort segments, always a treat, are made palatable with some well-placed dumpsters. But put all of that aside, the smartest trick RE4 plays is how it weaves the franchise's horror DNA into a far more kinetic, far more visceral package. I'm Kevin with Broguelike. Until next time, friends.